there's a link to this source sheet again. I know it doesn't show up if you join late. All right, Parshat Mishpatim. We are at one of the significant transition points in Chumash. Last week, Parshat Yitro, we received the Aseret HaDibrot, the revelation at Sinai, the Ten Commandments, and we are it's hard to say that it's a full transition, but Mishpatim is certainly a break from what we've been accustomed to, in that it is primarily a long, extended list of mitzvot. And it's we're no longer really following a narrative arc, although at the end of the Parsha, it does return us to Har Sinai, and there's interesting things that are said about structurally how we have last week the revelation at Sinai, the Aseret HaDibrot, followed by a set of commandments, right? Even at the end of Parshat Yitro, there were a few mitzvot, and then the long list in Mishpatim focused primarily or exclusively on what we would label as civil law. It's a good parsha for talking about Jewish business ethics and things of the sort. And then at the end, we return back to Har Sinai and the famous declaration, which I think will be the Shabbos for Torah, exploring a little bit when the Jewish people declare Na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do and we will listen. So it's kind of a bookmark. And Rashi at the beginning of the parsha, well often quoted Rashi, says that the parsha begins Ve'ele HaMishpatim, that these are the statutes, these are the rules that you shall place before them. And Rashi says that the vav of Ve'ele and these is to show a connection, that just as what we read previously in Parshat Yitro was given directly by Hashem to Moshe at Har Sinai, so too the Mishpatim, the civil law that follows in our Parsha, was given directly to Moshe from Hashem at Har Sinai. And we return to Har Sinai at the end. So it's sort of all bracketed by, we have the revelation, a few what we'll call ritual laws at the end of Parshat Yitro, civil laws in Parshat Mishpatim, bracketed again by returning to the description of what happened at Har Sinai, which really shows structurally what Rashi tells us, Ve'ele HaMishpatim, that everything really comes from Har Sinai, and we shouldn't see it as a total break in what's been going on, that it's really a continuation of what took place in last week's Parsha. But that's not going to be our focus for tonight. For tonight, we're going to look at one of these Mishpatim, one of these civil laws, and see what there is to say about it. So let's share the source sheet. Did I get the right screen tonight? Everyone can see the source sheet? Yeah, okay. So we have an often quoted rule halacha, v'ger lo toneh v'lo tilachatzenu, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. You shall not oppress the stranger, for you were the stranger in the land of Egypt. And this is one of the major themes. And this notion of not oppressing the stranger because we were strangers in Egypt, we've discussed on several occasions, repeats itself over and over in the Torah. I believe it's 36 times that we find some similar reference, and there's great significance to that. Kol almana v'yatom lo te'anun, do not oppress any widow or orphan. Im anei te'aneh oto, ki im tza'o ki tzak elai, shamoa eshma tza'akato. Very difficult pasuk to translate. If you will torture or oppress any of these groups of people, and they will call out to me, I will hear their cry. V'chara api v'haragti etchem becharev, v'yuneshechem amanot v'nechem yutomim. And I will grow angry at you if you carry out such oppression of such people, and I will kill you with sword, and your wives will be widowed, and your children will be orphaned. Like, I guess there's kind of a um, uh, reward and right, that the punishment fits the crime, right? That you torture the widow and the orphan, so therefore your wives will be widowed and your children will be orphaned. Im kesef talveh et ami, if you lend money to anyone in my nation and to any Jew, et ta'ani imach lo tia lo kinoshev lo tasimun alav neshech. If you lend money to the poor, do not act toward them as a creditor, exact no interest from them. Im chabol tachbol simlat re'echa ad bo hashemesh teshivenu lo. And if, as a collateral on this loan, you take the person's nightgown or blanket that they sleep with at night, their night covering, you must return it to them when the sun sets. It is his only covering for his skin. What else will he sleep in? He will scream to me, and I will hear, for I am compassionate. Okay, so there's a lot that we could focus on in this brief passage. Are these two? We seem to have two separate halachot. One, not to oppress the stranger. Included in that is the widow and the orphan, and then this idea of when we make loans to people, we have to return the night covering if that's the only covering that the person has. And interesting, in both instances, we have sort of, in ways that we wouldn't normally expect, God's harsh reaction. So in the first instance of not oppressing the stranger, God says, I will be angry and I will kill you by sword. And then further on, after describing this idea of how we should collect or not hold on to collateral all the time, Vishamati ki chanun ani. I will hear, for I am compassionate. Right? Doesn't seem to fit into what we would typically expect to be the normal way in which a civil law is described. That God seems to be inserting some sort of emotional reaction, a punishment based on emotions, based on empathizing and identifying with the victim in these situations, which is not typical of how the halachot are normally described in the Torah. Are there any other details or questions that jump out to you as we're looking at this short passage?
This section, I think, it resonates with COVID time. Tens of millions of people who are in danger of being evicted in the middle of winter because of the cessation of the suspension of evictions. Tens of millions of people who are food endangered.
Okay.
I'm a little surprised by how specific the first punishment is and how vague the second one is. The first instance, it says, my anger will blaze forth and I put you to the sword. The second time it says, therefore, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed. And what that means, it doesn't specify.
Right. There's no, there's not the same specificity of punishment in the second case. That's interesting. That's that God will hear. Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
I've always been impressed that God is directly inserting himself into the judicial process, meaning that this will work even when our judicial system is totally non-functioning.
Oh, interesting. So so ultimately justice will be meted out. Seems to be what.
Right, but it's not. But even if the best in does not work at all.
Right, which seems to be a contradiction to one of the major principles we have when it comes to adjudicating civil cases, which is Eino Ladayan Elamashe Inavroot, that the judge only has what his eyes can perceive. Generally a case in court is only based on the facts in front of the judge and only based on what, right, it's not necessarily getting at if there's an absolute truth, but it's getting at what the facts are and how the human judge interprets it. But Gary points out that no, there seems to be some insurance that there will be, at least in these two instances, right? It's unclear whether this holds true for other instances where there's a victim, if there is an ultimate sense of justice that we can rely on, or that God says we will ultimately be realized. But it's a beautiful observation that certainly in this case, God is interfering, so it seems, with the normal proceedings of the court. Anything else?
I think also, a lot of times the Torah, the laws of the Torah are sometimes compared to the Code of Hammurabi, which seem to have three different levels of justice. The not royalty, but the nobility, right, and sort of the common man and the lower class. And this seems to indicate that the lower class, the people who really have no power in the Hammurabi Code, have a great deal of power in the Jewish Code.
Right. It's always been my understanding, and maybe I don't think we mentioned this last week when we explored Yitro, but part of the reason and the significance of Yitro advising Moshe on how to set up the court system. And right, we discussed last week whether there's whether that follows chronological order, or there's significant opinions among the commentators that say Yitro actually came several years after Matan Torah. But if we take it on face value that Yitro comes before the giving of the Torah, I've always understood one of the lessons of that is that Bnei Yisrael had to have an encounter with other legal norms of their day before being given the Torah, in order to appreciate how radically different the Torah is in many of the details, many of the laws, than what the norms in the world around them were. So part of following Yitro's advice and being exposed to how Yitro thought things should be might have been a way to give exposure to what the legal norms and ethics of the day were, in order that we can really appreciate how radically different God's rules are once we get them later on in that parsha. It's been a while since I've gone into any detail on the comparison of Hammurabi's code and what the Torah lays out, but everyone always points to ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, whether that's taken literally or whether that's as the rabbis tell us, should be read as monetary value. But yeah, there are very stark differences between what the Torah tells us and what Hammurabi and other norms of that day, of that era, were set up as. Okay, so if there's no other comments or thoughts, we'll just note that this halacha, like many others, is repeated in Devarim as well, in Perek Kaf Dalid. Ki tasher b'reacha mash'et me'uma, lo tavo el beito la'avot avoto. When you make a loan of any sort to your countryman, you must not enter his house to seize his pledge. V'chutz ta'amod, v'a'ish asher tanoshe bo yotzi elecha et avot hachutza. You have to stay outside of the house, and the debtor will bring you the collateral, bring you the pledge outside. If he is a poor person, you may not sleep in his pledge. You must return it to him when the sun sets, and he can sleep in his night clothing. And he will bless you. And it shall be for you tzedakah. It shall be for you a merit before Hashem, your God. Right? So if in Sefer Shmot, we see how God punishes those who act cruelly to the extremely poor. Here, there's a way to sort of gain more favor in God's eyes, right? If you do the right thing, if you do return this this night clothing, this night garments, as is mandated, then it will be a bracha for you both in the eyes of your debtor and in the eyes of Hashem, which is quite interesting as well. Again, not typical in how the Torah normally describes these types of halachot. Okay, so to our first thing to note, our first source on this is the Gemara in Bava Metzia, which wants to know why this halacha is repeated twice. Seems to be almost an exact carbon copy from Shmot and Devarim. Tani Rav Shizvi Kami de Rava. So Rabbi Shizvi says before Rava, Ad bo Hashemesh teshivenu lo zo kisut laila. In Sefer Shmot, when it says until the sun sets, you need to return it to him, this refers to a night garment. Hashev tashiv lo et ha'avot kivo Hashemesh zo kisut yom. And it reads the verse from Devarim that you shall return it to him when the sun sets, or really, I guess, when the sun rises, is how he's reading it, refers to a daytime garment. Amar le diyamama b'layla lamali v'delayla b'yama yamama lamali. So why would you need to take a night garment in daytime, and why would you take a day garment in nighttime? Amar le isaime. She says, okay, should I skip over this whole thing? You're saying there's nothing significant here? Amar le lo. Says, no, there is something significant to be learned from this. Hachi ka'amar. This is how we should read it. Ad bo Hashemesh teshivenu lo zo kisut yom, shnitzna lachbol balayla, hashev tashev lo et ha'avot kivo Hashemesh zo kisut laila, shnitzna lachbol bayom. Right. So it says it teaches us that if you are taking as a pledge something which is normally worn at nighttime, then you can hold it during the day and return it at night. And if you're taking something which is normally worn or used during the daytime, then you can hold it overnight, but you have to return it in the daytime. Okay, so it's a little technical, but it gets interesting if we look at what the Rambam does with it in number 4. The Rambam tells us, we're going to pick up in the second line. Im ish ani hu davar shehu tzarich lo harei ze mitzuva lachazir lo havot be'et shehu tzarich lo. If you take as a pledge, as a collateral, from a very poor person, something which that person needs, you have to return it to them at the time when they need it. Machazir lo et hakar b'layla kedei lishon alav. The Rambam reads it as a pillow or a blanket. If you take his pillow or his blanket, which is used at night, you have to return it to him at night so he can sleep with it. If you take his plow, you have to return it to him during the day so he can do work with it. As it says, you should return to him the pledge. If you don't return the item to the debtor at the proper time, then the creditor transgresses a negative commandment. As it says, do not sleep or do not hold his pledge. Do not sleep while you have the collateral, the pledge with you. This refers to something which the person needs at nighttime. And with things that are normally used during the daytime, it says, until the sun sets, you have to return it to him. You have to return it to him the entire day. So you have to return it to the person at the time when he needs the object, but you can hold it as collateral at a time when he doesn't need it. And so then the Rambam asks the question, which will explore in further sources as well. He says, Mayo il hamashkon. What's the purpose then of the collateral? If the person, if the debtor can use it every time he needs it, what's the point of collecting it as collateral, right? The whole point of taking something as collateral is because you want to pressure the person to pay you back. So if I know that I can sleep with my pillow every night, what does it bother me if you're holding it during the daytime, or if it's lying on my bed unused during the daytime? Right? What's the point? So rather than read the Rambam, let's see some of the more primary sources on this. We're going to skip first to source number 8, the Gemara in Bava Metzia. Further on the page that we saw previously, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mashkeno, who made, Amar Rabbi Meir, V'chim yachar shemam shcheninin lama machzirin. Right, so why, if you take it as collateral, the same question we just saw, why would you return it? That's the exact it seems to be defeating the purpose of collecting collateral, of holding on to collateral. So they say, Lama machzirin, Rachmana Amar ahadar. Right? Well, it's a silly question because God told us you have to return it. So, okay, we could just say God said and that's it. Ela me'achar shemachzirin, lama chozrin, umam shchinin. Right? So once you return it, why would you then take it again as collateral? Why do we go through this whole dance of every day, or right, whether it's sunrise or sunset, going outside of the debtor's house and giving and collecting and giving and collecting? Right? Why are we going through this? So the Gemara gives us two possibilities. Number one, if we don't go through this dance of collecting and returning and collecting and returning, then the debt will be totally wiped out when Shemitah comes. You might say, well, that's the point of Shemitah, is that we want to forgive debts for someone who can't repay the debt, but we also want to ensure that people will continue to give loans. So as a guarantee that the loan will ultimately be repaid, that's part of the function of the collateral. So we have to continue to hold the collateral in order that the debt will not be totally wiped out, and that even if Shemitah comes, the creditor will be able to collect eventually. And the second is lo ya'aseh metal talin etzel banav, that if the debtor dies, we don't want the collateral to go as an inheritance to his children, but the creditor gets first claim, right? That before any of the estate gets distributed to any heirs, that this is a guarantee that upon the death of the debtor, that the creditor will be able to collect. So that's two reasons that Gemara gives as to why we have to go through this dance of every night or every day, collecting and returning and collecting and returning. Number one, that it will be a guarantee that the loan remains on the books and can still be repaid even if Shemitah comes. And number two, as a guarantee that if the debtor passes away, that the estate will first cover the debts before being given to any as an inheritance.
Is this sort of like an element of bankruptcy law in business, where, as I understand it, there's a status whereby a company goes bankrupt, but they remain in possession of the productive tools that they use to make money by making products that they can sell, so they can pay the debts that they can't pay yet.
Yeah, it's similar. It's similar. Right there, there's a lot of interesting articles whether halacha recognizes any concept of bankruptcy, and it's hard to make an exact analogy because halacha doesn't really recognize or have the concept of a corporation in the same way that we do. But yes, in the sense that bankruptcy laws are set up to allow a company to try to continue to operate and turn a profit and be able to repay its debts. If you just seize all assets at the beginning right away, then there'd be no hope of ever repaying the debt and ever leaving bankruptcy. So it is a similar idea on an individual level. So that's a nice parallel. Okay, a few more explanations as to why we're going through this charade. The Ibn Ezra in source number 6 writes, quoting Sadia Gaon, Amar HaGaon, Ma ta'am lakacha tachavu bayom v'yashivenu balayla, v'heshiv ba'avur sheyir'eh shel yoveh me'acher, v'yitnenu lo chavo tachtav. Right, so he says it's also a way to ensure that this debtor won't cheat the system, right? He says, well, I have a plow. I only have one plow. It's all that I have. And I've given it as a pledge to this one guy, but this guy lets me use it every day. So maybe I'll take another loan from a second person and I'll give the same plow as a pledge to him, right? So by allowing the first creditor to hold it even at a time, right, even if he has to return it on a regular basis, but by holding it, it sort of is a guarantee that the debtor will not go and take more debt, take on more debt, take on more loans, using the same item as collateral multiple times. So it protects against that. It's a protection for the creditors, for the lenders, that people won't take advantage of the system in too egregious a way. That's another explanation for why we go through this. And finally, from the other perspective, the Shadal, Samuel David Luzzatto from Italy, writes, Halove biyoto mukhrach lalechet b'chol erev or b'chol boker lakachat simlato yishtadel l'shalem chova. Says even though the debtor is able to still benefit from using his night garment, using his plow, using his tools, it's still somewhat of an embarrassment, right? It's not an ideal situation that every day he has to make an arrangement to collect it and return it, to go through this whole thing. So the Shadal says that it will actually be added incentive for him to repay the debt.
But this says the debtor has to go, and as I read the Torah, the creditor has to go.
Right. So I don't know. I'm not sure why he says that. I just it occurred to me also as I was reading it. You're right. The Torah says very clearly that the creditor has to go and collect it from the house. The Gemara does go struggle with this a little bit. It seems maybe the first time that's the case, but if this is going to be an ongoing situation, it would make sense that the debtor would be more inconvenienced than the creditor. So it could be just kind of as a way to emphasize that the Torah is saying in the first time that we really don't want to intrude on the personal private space of the debtor, but if this is an ongoing arrangement, maybe the debtor would be the one who has to go out of his way to return and collect it every day. But it's a good question, Gary. I'm just conjecturing there. I don't know for sure. I don't know why the Shadal writes that. Okay, so those are a few explanations as to why we go through this whole song and dance of returning every day, right? I wanted to give another suggestion. I don't have any sources here. I ran out of time in compiling everything, but it's something that I know we've explored previously. And that is the idea that clearly this person, this debtor, is destitute, right? He only has one pillow. He only has one thing that they can offer as collateral, and that's something that they need on a daily basis. Right? This is someone who really is at the end of their, things are not good for this person. Very, very desperate financial situation. So why go through, right? Why doesn't the Torah just say, if someone's this poor, give them tzedakah? Right? Why is it that we have to give this person a loan and collect collateral to ensure that they're going to pay back the loan? This is clearly someone who would be deserving of tzedakah. And I think that one suggestion might be is that it's a way of ensuring the dignity, right? Just like we don't allow the creditor to go into his house to collect on the collateral, right? That even if it's someone who really is deserving of tzedakah, that it's embarrassing for someone to feel that they're getting a handout. And so part of what the Torah is telling us is, let's preserve the dignity of our fellow Jew, of our fellow of someone who's really at the end of their luck, with down and out. Let's preserve their dignity. Let's give it the facade of being a loan, even if it's not really a loan we can realistically expect will be repaid in any reasonable time frame, if at all. But it's a loan, right? In the same way, the sources I would have brought, if I hadn't run out of time, would be sources that talk about how even someone who is supported by tzedakah, afilu ani hamitz parnes min tzedakah chayav litain tzedakah, still has to give tzedakah, right? And one of the reasons for that is because if someone is so destitute that they're always on the receiving end, right? We hear about this all the time, how they just internalize that fact that they're just going to be recipients of welfare their whole life, and they're not going to be able to improve their situation. But if we give them the sense that you are someone who's able to take out a bona fide loan and be part of the regular economy and commerce and way that things operate for people that are not down and out, so that might be added hope in a way of maintaining the dignity of the person, that they will break out of this destitute situation. So that's a third. I lost track of what number we're up to. Maybe it's number 5, as to why we still go through this charade of every day collecting and returning the collateral, rather than just say forgive the debt or turn it into a tzedakah donation. Is that would not be the most dignified way for this debtor to feel that they're able to get the help that they need, and that keeping it as a loan might help maintain that sense of dignity that we want to try to ensure that everyone feels. That was a thought that I had. Any reactions to that? Any questions, comments so far?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
The requirement that you stay outside the person's house when you come to collect the debt, does that have any sort of interpretation that might be used in modern day commerce?
Does it have interpretation in modern day commerce? Meaning, if there is a foreclosure on a property, or I think the law allows the collection agent to go and take what's due to them. I don't think that, at least in American law, I don't know that we have that same kind of limit on how you can access to get the material.
Well, does Torah law have any? Is it used in Israel in secular law?
I don't know the answer. It's a good question, Judy. I don't know. There's a lot written about Mishpatim, about modern day Israel law and the influence of halacha and Torah on seemingly secular law. I don't know the answer. It's a great question. If I have time, I'm intrigued. So I'm going to try to find the time to do a little research on that. And if you want to do some research too, we can meet back and see what we come up with. It's a great question.
What happens if the debtor doesn't defaults on his loan? Is the creditor then allowed to keep the pillow?
Yeah, so it seems that the Torah here is allowing this to go on for a long time. If the debtor says, I'm never going to be able to do it and I give up, then presumably yes, right? It remains as a legitimate collateral. We'll maybe question that again once we see the next two sources, but certainly halachically speaking, it is within the right, and if the debtor gives up any hope of repaying it, or says this is an untenable situation, then yes, then presumably the creditor can keep it as in lieu of payment, and that's the whole point of the collateral. So,
right.
But the Gemara telling us that we do this in order to extend it beyond Shemitah implies that if there is any I'm blanking. If there is any term limit, statute of limitations on it, it's a very long one.
Well, as for a defaulting debtor, what about the widow whose creditors are going to take her 2 sons and Elisha Hanavi had it, all the pots filled with oil that she could sell.
Right.
So there was some kind of penalty for defaulting.
Right, right. The meaning that they're even poor people, if they can't repay their debt, you have to pay the consequences at some point. Right. Part of that story, and as we'll see, I think in the next two sources, is that maybe the Torah wants to move us beyond that strict legal framework to try to think about this, and that's part of the reason that we have this right, the abnormal or the uncharacteristic description of God's reaction to these situations. If you act inappropriately, right, that God will hear their cry and God is compassionate, right, that might be trying to instill in us to go beyond the letter of the law, but certainly the letter of the law is still there, and it is possible to collect on debts. And but exactly the parameters, I don't know the exact parameters of when we would enforce that, or when we give up hope of being repaid, but it is certainly a possibility.
Rabbi?
Yes.
No, I just wanted to add something to what you were saying. I was thinking that if a person has to go back and forth with an object in their hands to somebody's house, even though they're not allowed to go into the house, that they are beginning to put themselves in the other person's place each time when they go. Sense.
Yeah.
It is perhaps the opportunity for it to dawn on them to come up with another solution. Now, Jeff just mentioned one of the great classic solutions, and the Rambam would say,
is to have Elisha perform a miracle for you.
The highest form of tzedakah would be to provide work for the person.
Yeah.
So, that there are other options. You don't have to necessarily perhaps give them directly tzedakah, but one would hope that as a person's going back and forth and then really coming to realize what this person's life is like, maybe something else would occur to them. It provides them with that opportunity.
That's a beautiful thought. I mean, maybe that's why we, part of it is also to, obviously these people had some relationship beforehand if you're willing to make the loan, but that this is a way of humanizing that relationship more and giving a greater perspective to the creditor of what the reality of the debtor's life is. And as you say, hopefully being able to work together to find a solution to the problem rather than just saying, pay me back, and that's the end of it. So with that in mind, let's look at, this is another source of the same Shadal that we saw previously. Nechama Leibowitz is very fond of him, and she brings this in her analysis of these psukim. The Torah inspires us to be compassionate and generous through the allocation of the gleanings, the forgotten sheaf in the corner of the field to the poor, stranger, and widow, through the prohibition of usury, the entering of the debtor's home to take a pledge, and the taking and pledge of the garment worn by the borrower. The creditor quite rightly wishes to take a pledge when the debtor refuses to pay. If he has to turn it in every evening, there is no doubt that the borrower will never pay back his debt. Why should I return it? He has my money. How am I ever going to get it back? What concern is it of mine in what he seeks? So says the creditor. All the philosophers and honors seekers will justify him. But the Torah, teaching us compassion and generosity, says to the creditor, and what else will he seek? Right, so exactly what we've just been discussing, that yes, it's totally within the legal rights of the creditor to collect on the debt, insist on it, to hold collateral, but the Torah, in giving this in an uncharacteristic way, emphasizing God's compassion in this situation, is trying to instill in the creditor that sense of empathy and identification with the plight of the debtor, so that he won't insist on collecting this debt, that he will be compassionate and perhaps forgiving to him. And then finally, we come to the Sridei Eish of Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who lived, escaped from Poland during World War II to Switzerland. And for those, he was the main teacher, the main Rebbe of Eliezer Berkovitz, whose work we've studied extensively. So in the context of, it was a tshuva, it was a shaila posed to him about whether the Torah mandates, what exactly the parameters are of lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. He quotes our pasuk. Yesh pasuk mefurash b'Torah, ki kisuto levado, hi simlato le'oro b'ma yishkav. Right? It quotes our verse, right? That it's his only garment for nighttime. What else will he sleep in? Yitzak elai v'shamati ki chanunani. And he will call, the debtor will call out to me, and I will hear, for I am compassionate. HaTorah hirbeta bidvarim maridim et halev. The Torah goes into great depth and detail with words that cause the heart to tremble. Kidei lomar lahamalveh she'af al pi shemitzad hamishpat eino mechuyav lahachazir et hamashkon shnitan lo le'eravon aval b'mei yishkav. That even though the creditor is right from a pure legal sense, this pure sense of justice, that he can collect on the debt that's owed him, and he does not have to return the collateral, the pledge, every night, but he should, because of this sense of bamei yishkav, what else is this person going to sleep in, right? That he's supposed to, not from a legal sense, but from an empathetic sense, return the pledge every night. So we kind of, right, the Gemara tells us, why does he have to return it every night? Because God said return it every night. Sri Desh is saying, no, God's not saying that it's a legal requirement to return it every night. According to the Sri Desh, this is a strictly moral and ethical imperative that the Torah is giving. If you want to talk strict justice, if you want to talk letter of the law, this collateral is yours. If the time, whatever time frame you arrange for repayment of the debt, if he can't repay it, it's yours. You don't have to return it. And that's the end of things. But the Sri Desh is saying that no, that the Torah is going uncharacteristically to paint the full situation and create empathy, is to make this into a moral and ethical question and not a legal question. Morally and ethically, the creditor should continue to return the pledge every night or every day to the debtor, even though legally that's not required. Haresha hishira Torah al harachmanut. The Torah, in this way, tries to instill in us a sense of compassion and empathy. And just to spell it out more fully, Rabbi Baruch Gigi, who is one of the current Roshei Yeshiva at Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush, writes as follows on this. The Torah could have presented, I'm reading the second paragraph, the Torah could have presented any of a broad range of other verses to command us to lend assistance to the poor. You shall surely help the poor. You shall surely show compassion to the poor of your people, or the such. Instead, it emphasizes the human aspect of civil law itself. It demands that judges be capable of observing, evaluating, and understanding the person standing in judgment. It demands of them not to be right, but rather to be wise. And this wisdom is itself divine justice. Which I thought is just a beautiful articulation of what I think this was all building up to. Is that, yes, we can talk strict letter of the law. We can talk strictly about what is due from a perspective of justice. But what seems to be going on here is that the Torah is trying to push us beyond that. And right, whether that's it's commonly phrased as lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. And it's a fascinating question. Is that a halachic requirement? Can halacha require us to go beyond what the halacha requires? Or is lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law, something beyond the legal system, right? That we can talk about in a court of law if the creditor were to go to debtor's court and say that this guy owes me money, or I'm going to hold on to the collateral. Yeah, maybe even the Torah would agree that that's in his right, but that the Torah is trying to convince him not to take that case to debtor's court. The Torah is trying to convince him that he should, even in the normal business interaction, develop that sense, a greater sense of empathy and identification with the plight of someone in so desperate a situation. And that's a fascinating question. A lot of writers on the halachic system, on philosophy of Jewish law, try to tackle this question. Right? What exactly do we mean when we say to go beyond the letter of the law? And can the legal system itself ever enforce such a thing? There are cases in the Talmud which seem to point in that way. One of the more well-known examples in the Talmud is one of the rich rabbis had servants who dropped and broke a barrel of wine, and at the end of the day, they come to him to ask for their daily wages. He says, "You want me to pay you? You owe me money. You just ruined thousands of dollars worth of wine. You expect I'm going to pay you your wages?" They go to court, and the court says, "No, you have to pay them, because it's part of a normal. Sometimes accidents happen, but these people were dependent on you for their living." So there are instances where it seems that even in the court system, we do enforce, or we can enforce, going beyond the letter of the law, this concept of lifnei mishur hadin. How exactly it gets carried out and when and under what circumstances, I don't think there's an exact principle to that. But it's a fascinating concept. It's one that's certainly worth thinking about. And again, it's all based on the uncharacteristic description in the beginning, in the verses that we saw at the beginning, showing how God is compassionate in these situations to these very destitute, very desperate people. And based on God's compassion and empathy, we're supposed to be empathetic as well, trying to emulate God and act godly and divinely. I'm going to stop. Any final questions or thoughts on this? All right. Next week, we have a special guest teacher. Cheryl Grossman will be teaching the shiur next week. It is National, forget the exact name, but it's Jewish Disability Awareness Month. So Cheryl will be teaching something on Jewish disability awareness. So even if you have friends that don't regularly attend, they might find that of interest. Next week, same time, same Zoom link. It will be Cheryl teaching instead of me. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Laila
Laila
Tov.
Good
Tov.
night, everyone. Yeah.